Tom, I know that we've been working hard on season 2 of the Carbon Removal Show. We've been researching, traveling places, going to events and stuff. We've been learning all sorts of things. It takes a lot of energy, but let me put it to you like this. By the time we get to the end of this episode, we're relaxing in the Blue Lagoon. We've got a glass of wine in one hand, we're taking selfies with the other, we've got our favourite colleagues and podcast pals around us.
Face masks on. Don't forget the face masks.
Of course. That's where we get to after all this hard work.
Yes, yeah. Just dreaming about it right now. And our listeners might be thinking, why on earth are 4 podcasters relaxing in the Blue Lagoon?
It's not just for the face masks and the lagoon side bar. The Blue Lagoon took us to serious carbon removal territory. We just happen to also enjoy the face masks and the lagoon side bar.
Well, let's get to the end of the episode.
To the Blue Lagoon!
See you there.
Hello, and welcome back to the Carbon Removal Show.
Sal og velkommen aftur.
Very impressive, Tom. Will you be translating the whole of today's episode?
I think that's probably, sadly, that's probably the limits of my Google Translate skills. So I think we'll probably leave it there.
I'm Emily Swaddle.
And I'm Tom Praviti. And as you've probably guessed, today we are bringing you the second episode from our team trip to Iceland.
Ew! Iceland road trip episode! In our last episode, you heard our roundup of the OK Bye event in Reykjavik for Iceland Innovation Week. It was a busy and exciting day, but for us, it was just the beginning. Over the next couple of days, we embarked on a whistle-stop tour of the southwest corner of the island, paying visits to a variety of businesses and interviewing the innovators who work for them.
And we were really keen to see some of the Iceland Innovation work in action.
Yeah, there was a lot of excitement in the car for sure.
We ended last episode with this question. Is Iceland merely a fertile playground for climate innovation, or might it also give us a greater glimpse of our potential shared future? Today, we're going to try and answer that, and to consider what this future might look like if other countries were to follow Iceland's example. For me personally, this was such a neat way to see the country. While it was very much a working holiday, this insight into the infrastructure of Iceland was super fascinating, and I think left us all with this much deeper sense of what makes this place unique from what we'd expected to get in just a few days here. It was also a pretty perspective-shifting experience, so we really hope that you listen to the end because we found it incredibly valuable.
What more could you ask for from a work trip? Shifting perspectives, exciting road trip, win, 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 win. As you know, we usually like to keep things quite carbon removal focused on the Carbon Removal Show, because we're traditionalists in that way. But this episode, we're zooming out a little bit. Not only because there was just so much we wanted to share with you, but also, as you'll see, because it's only by zooming out that we can begin to understand the role that carbon removal is playing in Iceland, and may begin to play in our future. Let's hit the road.
I'm ready to roll. Now, last episode, we mentioned Iceland's unique geology and existing energy infrastructure. Volcanic island at the meeting between 2 tectonic plates, making use of its abundance of geothermal activity. That unique energy ecosystem is drawing a lot of climate businesses to Iceland. And with this in mind, our first road trip was to visit the Hellisheiði power station and the public-facing geothermal energy exhibition. Now, I could have spent a long time wandering around that exhibition. Turns out there's a huge amount to learn about geothermal energy. And it's such a valuable public education tool, given its prevalence in Iceland. You can just stop by and see how your energy is generated.
The power station stands in the middle of the region's lunar-looking landscape. As we approach, it's the largest structure we can see, except for a few surrounding hills that are still holding on to the last of the winter's snow. The building itself is modern, glass, impressive, and made even more imposing by the huge steam clouds that are rising from the back of the complex.
With capacity to produce 303 megawatts of electricity, the Hellisheiði power station is the largest geothermal power plant in Iceland by power generation, and it's also in the top 10 in the world. It's actually 2.5 times larger than the next biggest one in Iceland. By our back of the envelope calculations, that means that in 1 hour of operating, it generates enough power to take 20,000 of the most efficient electric cars 100 kilometers each, or one of the most efficient electric cars 50 times around the equator.
That's pretty cool. Okay, so let's get into some of the basics here. How does geothermal power actually work?
The basics are simple. It's all about converting geothermal energy, that's heat from the earth, into electricity and or usable heat. The Hedlesedi power station uses a process known as flash steam, which means they drill deep into the earth to find wells of water that are very hot and under very high pressure.
How hot are we talking here, Tom?
I'd say about 180 degrees Celsius.
Just off the top of my head?
Just dip my toe in it. Yeah, it's definitely 180. 180 vibes.
And so that's not turned to steam because it's under so much pressure?
Correct. They then pull the water up into low pressure tanks where it immediately transforms into steam. The steam is used to turn turbines, which generate electricity, and any wastewater is returned underground. Simple, renewable energy.
Yeah, sounds wonderful. But it's not emissions free. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, that's the one that smells like rotten eggs, and our old friend carbon dioxide are among the gases released during the geothermal energy process.
So how much emissions are we talking here?
Well, one study found that this plant emits anywhere between 15 and 24 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions per megawatt hour of energy generated. So it's not nothing, but if we compare it to energy generated using coal, it can be over 50 times lower than those emissions. It's a big saving.
Wow, pretty low carbon then, in my books. And given that Iceland has millions and millions of megawatt hours in potential sites, it seems that geothermal energy is just a wise move for the country.
Yeah, they're using their natural resources. It should be noted, though, that only around 30% of Iceland's electricity is actually generated from geothermal. The majority of their power generation is through hydro. So that's harnessing the power of rivers, waterfalls, and the like.
Okay, they do have a lot of beautiful waterfalls.
Where the geothermal energy really shines is in heating. Hedlesedi, for example, also uses the heat from deep below to warm water at surface level. Around 90% of buildings in Iceland have their heating and hot water provided through geothermal heating. That's a lot. Walking around the exhibition and the power plant, it hits all of the senses. It's loud with machinery noise and shoots of steam. It's smelly with that rotten egg sulfur smell. The air is really damp. The atmosphere is eerie thanks to all the steam. I reckon if no one's ever set a horror movie at a power plant, they've missed a trick.
I don't really know how many horror movies you watched, Emily, but rotten eggs, loud machinery. I mean, like, maybe it is a perfect mashup.
I tell you, I might write a script. We could be billionaires.
In the landscape around the geothermal plant, you see these small white domes, just a few meters in diameter. These are Carbfix sites. We briefly mentioned Carbfix in the last episode when Dirk from DAC company Climeworks explained the partnership that the two companies have worked on. While Climeworks is in the business of removing carbon dioxide from the air, Carbfix works on the other end of the process, permanent sequestration. So why are Carbfix positioned directly next to the geothermal plant? Well, before our trip to Iceland, we spoke with Sandra Ósk Snæbjörnsdóttir to find out more about what they do.
So Carbfix dissolves CO2 in water. So essentially we are making sparkling water, which we inject into volcanic rocks, such as basalts. And these rocks contain a lot of metals. And by injecting this sparkling water into the ground, the metals are released from the rocks and they combine with the injected CO2 and form minerals. So we essentially turn the CO2 into stone. And of course, by turning CO2 to stone, it's not going to leak out of the ground. So it's a safe way of storing CO2. And so Carbfix is essentially providing a storage solution. We are storing the CO2 that can be captured by different processes. So, the bedrock doesn't really care from where the CO2 comes from. And we realize that we need to both capture from point sources, especially from these hard to abate sectors that we will still be relying on after we phase out fossil fuels. But we are also collaborating with companies that specialize in direct air capture. And we achieved the first chain of direct air capture and storage in the world in collaboration with Climeworks.
Well, how about that? Sparkling water is the solution that we've all been waiting for.
Just pour some San Pellegrino down a hole. When she described this, now I want to taste this sparkling water.
As Sandra explained, CarbFix provides a storage solution deep underground, which can be applied to true removals, like their pioneering work with carbon removed via DAC by Climeworks, or can be used to sequester carbon captured during other industrial or energy generation processes. And that's why they're positioning themselves right next to the Hetley-Savey geothermal power plant, sequestering some of the plant's CO2 and hydrogen sulfide output to make their energy production even less damaging to the environment.
What was it, 15 to 24 kilograms per equivalent per megawatt hour?
Correct. That's the greenhouse gas emissions from Hetley-Savey. And part of the reason that's lower than your average geothermal power plant is that, according to the power company's website, CarbFix helps to capture 30% of the plant's CO2.
Very cool, very cool. Like many parts of carbon removal processes, Sandra also told us how CarbFix's method is essentially an adaptation of a process that already occurs in nature. In this case, one of the ways that the Earth normally regulates the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Over geological timescales, in the Earth's deep past, when atmospheric CO2 increases, temperature, humidity, and precipitation generally increase, which accelerates the weathering of rocks. In other words, rocks breaking down and the minerals within them reacting with CO2 to draw it out of the atmosphere and sequester it in solid form. Of course, the rapidity of our current increase in the atmospheric CO2 means that this process is far, far too slow to make an appreciable difference. But what CarbFix and companies like it are doing is essentially recreating the conditions that enable this process, and in CarbFix's case, doing this deep underground.
Tom, have we mentioned permanence?
This solution is just oozing with permanence.
Well, actually, that's the point. It's not oozing at all. The CO2 is trapped in the rocks permanently. Zero ooze.
Yes, you're right. Maybe chock-a-block with permanence, let's say.
Much better. I like that. While at the plant, we popped into one of the white domes to see for ourselves what was going on. There isn't actually much to see. It's not like you can see down a well or see the CO2 being pumped down there or anything. There was just a series of pipes feeding into the ground. Simple as that.
Sandra explained that while they originally based themselves here to help neutralize the carbon emissions of the geothermal plant, the site would later become perfect for their partnership with Climeworks.
So initially we did a pilot with Climeworks. They brought a unit they called the Aztec Fox, which it was just a single module that could capture about 50 tons per year. And so we tested this chain, the whole direct air capture and storage chain through that system. But now they have the Orca plant, and it's right next to the Hetley-Savey geothermal plant where we are essentially born and raised, where we have been capturing CO2 since 2012. And the Orca plant can capture up to 4,000 tons per year. So they utilize both the geothermal heat and also the geothermally produced electricity from the plant to drive their DAC plant. Because, direct air capture or DAC, it doesn't make sense unless you have like a green energy source. And we are quite fortunate in terms of that in Iceland. So it's a very nice place to demonstrate this. We have the green energy and also the experience that CarbFix has been working on since the beginning of the project in 2007.
I said there's not much to see, but I didn't mean it disparagingly. I'm just marveling at the neatness of all this. The geothermal plant is producing abundant and renewable energy. That electricity does have some downsides, like all sources of energy generation. In this case, CarbFix jump in and help to capture some of their CO2 and hydrogen sulfide emissions, essentially putting them straight back underground where they came from and providing CarbFix with a great location to test and improve their own technology. Then, Climeworks comes along and say, we actually want to draw CO2 out of the air and develop and scale up this technology so it can be deployed broadly. And this location, therefore, also has a load of benefits for them. As we know, that can be energy intensive, but they're right here by the geothermal plant, and it's giving them low carbon heat and power, and it's made all the more low carbon thanks to Carbfix. And because Carbfix is just a stone's throw away, they can also work with Climeworks to sequester the CO2 that they're capturing. It's genius.
I love it. And it was a real privilege to see it all in practice. After seeing Carbfix's work in action, we pulled up to Climeworks' Orca plant that Sandra mentioned here. Now, let me tell you, it wowed me.
Tom, you were so excited.
Genuinely, I was so excited. We've been talking about DAC facilities for so long now, and we were finally seeing one in real life. And not just any one. This is the largest DAC plant currently in operation worldwide. And it took me back. It was quite a moment for me.
I genuinely wish we'd got a video of you as we drove up to the site so that we could share it with our listeners. It was like just so much joy. It was like a kid going to Disneyland.
Not all businesses attracted to the geothermal plant are there to store CO2 permanently. We went to visit another company just across the road, Vaxa, a food production company. Nothing at all to do with carbon removal, or so you might think. We spoke to Kiddy Haflidason, who told us about the inspiration behind the business.
So this geothermal power plant is actually where this all started. The father of this project, this company, is called Iceland Innovation. He was as a postdoc at MIT. He was working with NASA on creating a platform to grow algae in the International Space Station. And he came here in 2016, and we have been trying to get him here for 3 years. He was playing pretty hard to get. He came in 2016, and he immediately fell in love with Iceland, the possibilities, and just the whole ecosystem, like the big ecosystem, the people, the technology here, the spirit, and everything. And then he came to a geothermal power plant, and he said, you can do absolutely amazing things here, but there's a technology gap. There is no technology anywhere that we could buy and set up right next to this power plant to really take advantage of everything that this place has to offer. We need to go home. We need to invent stuff. So he went home, he talked to his biologist, and he talked to his engineer, and they spent 9 months in basically inventing what we call now E2F, the system, the platform that is the core of Vaxa. It's the E2F platform, energy to food. And the platform was created around everything that this location has to offer.
We're beginning to see a different business mindset operating here. It's not a case of what can we produce and sell, but what resources do we have at our disposal and what can we do with them?
Yeah, I really love it. And in the case of Vaxa, there are several resources that they can draw on here. They use CO2 to help the algae grow, or algae if you're American. And I suppose if you're Icelandic, you get to use both because you have both tectonic plates going through your nation. So take your pick.
Depends how you're feeling on the day.
They also use the cold water that's on its way into the geothermal plant. It's going to be heated by geothermal energy and then sent out again to be used as heating and hot water across the region. So Vaxa can use it to cool their systems with no worry that it'll subsequently need to be cooled down again. It's going to be heated anyway. And of course, they also use electricity and hot water produced by the plant in their own processes.
The more I think about it, there's just so many benefits for businesses to be close to power plants.
Really loads.
On our visit to the Vaxa site, we were lucky enough to get a tour through their facility to see the algae production in action. Before entering, we were fully decked out with overcoats, goggles, radio headsets, and everything like that, so we could hear Kiddy's commentary over the noise of the machinery.
I remember it was really loud in there, but it was so interesting to have Kiddy as a tour guide. He pointed out all the points where resources come in and out, how they're used across the system, and how the Vaxa machinery follows a modular design so their plans to scale up can move fast and efficiently. One of the things that stuck with me was all of the bubbles. You could see the CO2 being pushed through the hydroponic system to feed the algae, and it was just a continuous stream of bubbles. Loved it.
Well, for me, it was actually the lights. Another way that Vaxa makes their system so efficient is the lighting is coloured in a sort of pinky hue. Vaxa have made all their lights in this factory emit that exact wavelength of colour that the algae thrive in for their photosynthesis. There's no point in wasting energy on producing other colours of light when the crop just won't use them. It's this level of ultra efficiency that makes this sort of food production so attractive, and conventional farming just cannot match it.
Yeah, it means that Vaxa can produce food with just a fraction of the resources of traditional methods. So their website claims that they consume less than 1% of land and fresh water typically used, while yielding 10 times the product. It's impressive.
Wow.
And it's not just about how they use their resources. Their drive for efficiency starts from the very crops that they've chosen to cultivate. Kitty explained to us that with soy production, for example, once the crop has grown and has been harvested, we only actually use about 2% of the plant for human nutrition, the bean. That's all that we eat. When Vaxa harvests the algae, up to 50% of it can be used for human nutrition. And on top of that, a soy field might offer, 2 harvests a year? Kitty was proud to tell us that in the Vaxa process, they have a full harvest every 15 days.
That is very impressive, but I'm not sure I'm ready quite yet to swap my soy burger for an algae sludge sandwich.
I mean, you're missing out, Tom, but I understand. And actually, that's not what Vaxa is selling. So the algae that they grow is being used primarily in food supplements. The perfect fit given its long list of nutritional benefits. So obviously it's rich in protein.
Algae sludge protein shakes, sounds good.
It also gets one up on soy, though, because it has a complete essential amino acid profile and it's rich in micronutrients.
Nice. Yeah, it's making more sense, this whole food supplement usage piece. Okay, let's get back to carbon. The Vaxa system can use carbon dioxide emitted during geothermal production to feed their algae crop. Very efficient for them, the algae will love it, and the CO2 ends up locked in that biomass. But my question is this Vaxa system strictly carbon removal if it's just using that captured carbon rather than removing it permanently? We posed this question to Kitty, and he offered another way to think about it.
So, yeah, I mean, of course, algae are primary producers. They need energy. Usually they get it from the sun, but we take the sun out of the equation. Our factory is completely closed up. There's no natural light in our factory. We give them artificial lights. And they use this light energy to convert water and CO2 into biomass, and they breathe out oxygen. And that's it. When in 5 years, when we're at phase 5 with the full factory, we will be growing about 1,000 tons of biomass, which means that we can fix about 2,100 tons of CO2 in our biomass. If we are looking globally at carbon removal, these numbers are not interesting. Like 2,100 tons, cute, but not interesting. But the fact that we are taking this biomass and we are using that biomass as nutritional ingredients into food, and that food can be consumed by us humans, then we don't have to consume other food stuff. So the food that we replace, we need to start looking at that. What can this biomass, what food can it replace? And if we are looking at the nutritional value that we can extract from our biomass, from our algae, and we equate that to the nutritional value from other foods, let's say from beef or pork or poultry, we see that we can replace X amount of tons of beef or pork or poultry. And the CO2 emission that it would have happened if we would have to make this food from beef or pork or poultry, that becomes interesting to look at, because those food originators, the food that is made from this stock, emits a lot of CO2. So if we not only look at the CO2 that we fix in our biomass, but also we look at the CO2 that we can prevent from being released in the atmosphere by substituting other types of food, that becomes interesting.
So, while Vaxa isn't actually sequestering large amounts of carbon in the way that Carbfix is, their process could potentially reduce carbon emissions in an otherwise hard to decarbonize, high-emitting industry. And they can use carbon that might otherwise be emitted to run their operations.
If we think about this as more of a reduction project that utilizes captured carbon rather than a carbon removal project, I think we can see more of the picture and also really appreciate the benefits of this solution. It brings us back to that big question about balancing utilization and sequestration. We know that sequestration is preferable in terms of permanence, getting carbon out of the atmosphere for the long term, but utilization does have its benefits. And for one thing, it's easier to create a business model if you have a product to sell. And as in this case, some of the utilized carbon could be repurposed in innovations that actually help cut emissions elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And if you think about it, that carbon that's not being sequestered might actually have a larger impact if we zoom out a bit and look at the big picture.
This does sound like a complex calculation that would need loads of nuance depending on the context, geographical location, time frame. You're thinking about all these considerations, but ultimately, it's just good to know that we can do both these things. They're possible. And what's more, they're happening right here on this very site in the middle of the Icelandic countryside.
Now, if you're feeling inspired by what you've heard so far and you wish you could do more to rid the atmosphere of carbon, great news! You can. One of our sponsors, Patch, is the platform for climate action. They make it easy for businesses and their end customers to neutralise their carbon footprint.
Patch works with companies in crypto, fintech, e-commerce and more to embed carbon removal projects into their products and services, or provide companies with the option to purchase carbon removal from vetted projects right from their platform. That means businesses can build carbon negative products and features that enable climate action at scale.
Build something climate positive with Patch. Head to patch.io/TCRS to learn how. Another day, another geothermal plant. Hurrah!
Yay!
This time we headed a few miles south and west to the Reykjanes Peninsula to visit the Svartsengi geothermal plant, the first geothermal power plant in the world to combine generation of electricity and the production of hot water.
At Svartsengi, they've been so keen to make the most of all the resources on their doorstep that they've set up a resource park, a growing cluster of businesses who have innovative uses for the many things the site has to offer. And as if to demonstrate just how active this landscape is, we actually felt an earthquake whilst we were there. And it's one of hundreds of small earthquakes that Iceland experiences each week, but the building shook and it was quite a dramatic experience. I was shook.
Yes, adding a little drama to the trip. That was fun. There are a lot of things to love about this place, but here's my number one. The name. Where I grew up, we had business parks, which were essentially like commercial units to rent from which to sell your wares or offer your services. Svartsengi is not a business park, it's a resource park. During our visit, we found out all about the resources this site could offer our business, should we choose to locate there. And it was a comprehensive list as well. So electricity, hot water, cold water, CO2, steam, lava-filtered seawater, geothermal water. Poof! I just love this shift in focus towards the resources that are naturally abundant and relatively easily procured.
It's a great list, and it's attracted a diverse set of businesses to the site so far. You've got a hotel, aquaculture companies, company producing growth factors for medical research and skincare, seafood processing, and just much more. Undoubtedly, the most well-known of these businesses is Iceland's famous Blue Lagoon.
Famous indeed. If you've been to Iceland in recent years, you've probably been there. And if any of your friends have been to Iceland, you've probably seen their pictures. Not only is the Blue Lagoon one of the most Instagrammable spots in Iceland, it's also been named by National Geographic as one of the 25 wonders of the world.
What you may not know, however, is that the Blue Lagoon isn't a natural feature of the landscape. It actually formed accidentally due to condensed discharge from the geothermal power plant. The water pooled in the uneven terrain, and its high mineral content essentially sealed the rock beneath, creating this permanent man-made lagoon.
Yeah. I mean, on the face of it, I have to admit, it doesn't sound particularly appealing. Bathing in the wastewater, the discharge from a power plant.
Now you put it that way, it doesn't sound very appealing at all.
It wouldn't be my first choice. Considering all the beautiful lakes and rivers and waterfalls and beaches that Iceland has to offer, it wouldn't be my first choice. But in the Blue Lagoon's case, This water comes from deep underground and it's naturally lovely and warm, and it's high in salt and silica. And after local people started bathing in the lagoon, they noticed beneficial effects, and researchers confirmed that compounds in the water do have beneficial properties.
Today, as well as the lagoon itself, the site hosts a range of spa facilities, 2 hotels, 3 restaurants, and a lab developing a range of skincare products that are sold internationally. It is a huge tourist draw and a brand with global recognition. And to think that it just all started by accident.
And it's not just that the Blue Lagoon is based here because the site offers the resources it needs, like some of the other businesses we've looked at. It's based here because the site created this unique phenomenon. And what started inadvertently is now a deliberate effort to make the most of everything that the lagoon has to offer. In recent years, the company operating the site has been researching the water's compounds and the unique algae that grows in it to understand what they could do with it. Their research indicates that combinations of the algae and the nutrients can replenish skin collagen and manage the symptoms of conditions like psoriasis. Hence, the skincare brand was born.
While we were there, we were lucky enough to have a tour of their laboratory, and it was super fascinating just seeing the different minerals that they'd isolated from the water and the algae. By the end, I think we'd all seen more algae over 2 days than we thought possible in a lifetime. We spoke to Fanar Jonsson, the Blue Lagoon's quality and environmental manager, who described how a different perspective, looking at this waste as a resource, really informs the work of the company.
I think it's very important that when you're looking into operations that you always have to look at ways to reduce the amounts that you're using. But in the same way that there are resource streams, access resource streams that originally was just looked at as waste, but looking at it in a different way and looking at how can we do something more with this resource? How can we make value added for the community? That's, I think, something that we always have to look into. And for example, the CO2, not looking at it just as an emission, but as a feedstock for the microalgae. We have to stop looking at or talking about waste, because it's just another resource for another stream for something to do further and further. And that's a part of the circular economy.
I think there's a subtle distinction here between the mindset behind companies like Vaxa and Blue Lagoon. Both are doing incredible things with so-called waste resources. But while Vaxa is setting out to solve a problem, agricultural resource use, Blue Lagoon is essentially taking these resources and creating something new, or a new version of something old, with their skincare products.
And it's important to note that the Blue Lagoon fully recognizes that their business still has environmental impacts, and they are working on reducing these. This is not only about tapping into that geothermal cycle and making use of existing waste streams from the nearby energy infrastructure, but also taking other active steps such as reducing their plastic use or recycling and sourcing local ingredients in their restaurants. Crucially, however, and in line with what we like to talk about, they work to offset all of their remaining carbon emissions through reforestation or afforestation projects and have partnered with a couple of organizations to do this.
We have an agreement with a company called Kolviður here in Iceland, who plants trees in line with our emissions. So we calculate our emissions in line with scope 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, so we are carbon neutralizing in regards to like planting trees in Iceland for our operations. But when we were thinking about, okay, we're transporting this to people abroad, it would be nicer for them to connect easily to something rather than just trees in Iceland. And what we have recently, in the last 1 or 2 years, we have an agreement with Pashama. So we are selling our skincare products all around the world, and we are in agreement with a transportation company that's calculating the emissions for transporting it to people anywhere in the world. And Pashama is then taking that amount that is being released and offsetting that in their operations.
We haven't talked much about reforestation and afforestation in Iceland so far, partly because there's been so much else to talk about. But in recent years, research has shown that before human settlement, large parts of the island were covered by trees. Today, there is very little tree coverage, and so a lot of people see this as yet another opportunity for the country to make positive climate impact and draw down significant amounts of carbon. Because there isn't the same competition for the use of this land as there might be in a more densely populated or farmed part of the world, This feels like a potentially great site for some pretty major reforestation projects. And to me, it's interesting that the Blue Lagoon are offsetting some of their emissions through these projects.
Totally. But as Fanar said, they're not only interested in domestic reforestation and afforestation projects. For emissions produced by their international shipping, the company is also partnering with our old friends Pachama. You'll remember their co-founder Diego from season 1.
Diego, I do remember. That was great to meet Diego. Obviously, from a purely atmospheric carbon perspective, 1 ton of carbon stored in an Icelandic forest is going to have the same impact as 1 ton stored in a South American rainforest, for example. That's providing that issues such as permanence and so on are all equal. But in terms of co-benefits, when these projects are done well, as we know, they can also have other social and environmental impacts on a local level. So there's something really resonant about the idea of offsetting your international transport emissions internationally, provided it's done sensitively and equitably, of course.
Ultimately, the Blue Lagoon serves as a really useful reminder that even for businesses who are making impressive efforts to reduce their own emissions and footprint in multiple ways, carbon removal will remain a useful tool for offsetting that remaining emissions for the many years to come. However, as Fanar said, this is a complex area. It comes with competing claims and, crucially, a deficit of reliable information for both companies and their customers.
I think at least we are looking into different types of projects as well in the future, how we can offset our carbon emissions and finding the best solution. And it's actually a jungle if you look at it in that way. There are so many icons, there are so many companies doing very great things, but at the same time you're always concerned about like greenwashing. You're always concerned that you're putting the money where it actually counts. And that's not just for companies looking into this jungle, but it's also consumers. Because how do consumers know that if I'm buying this product, it's actually being carbon neutralized? And that's one of the things that will be a challenge for the future, I think, to find something that people can trust. So for a company, I think the most important thing is that we are investing in something that our consumers or customers trust and understand.
We've talked a lot about how tree growing is a popular removal option, and there are many factors to this. The fact that people love trees, obviously, the fact that it's generally cheaper than most engineered solutions, and so on. But what Fanar reminds us is that companies choosing to offset their emissions with removals want to be able to communicate this work to their customers. Of course they do. It's partly self-serving, but it's also about giving customers an informed choice. And at the moment, many of these other removal approaches, they're just too unknown or speculative to be easily communicated in a way that people will trust. And because most people understand that trees store carbon, it makes this whole business of communicating your removal strategy to your customers so much easier. And maybe that's another reason why tree growing is such a popular solution among businesses.
Absolutely. And as for getting the word out there about other options, I hope this podcast goes some small way to helping that happen.
Tom, can we have a bit more ambition than that, please? We're not going to go a small way. We're going to go a huge way. We might go 50 times around the equator.
In an electric car.
Of course. So far, we've looked at businesses that are using the unique opportunities available to them in Iceland and using so-called waste products to develop businesses with a low or even positive environmental impact. For our final stop, we wanted to visit a company that is applying the technology it's developed in Iceland and is already deploying it worldwide at quite a significant scale.
That's right. From the dramatic landscape of the lava fields to an equally impressive view from an upper floor office in Reykjavik, we went to visit the base of Carbon Recycling International. Interestingly, Carbon Recycling also have a plant at the Svartsengi site, just a short hop from the Blue Lagoon and all the other resource park businesses. But they're doing something very different.
As we were setting up for the interview, I spotted an impressive-looking award and asked Omar Sigurbjörnsson, Director of Sales and Marketing, to explain how they got it.
Just as I was getting my cup of coffee there, I noticed on the desk that there was an award for Top Carbon Utilisation 2021, I think it was. First of all, congratulations. And second of all, can you tell us more about that award and how you got it and what process you went through to get it?
Yeah, I think The company itself is a bit of a pioneer in this space, which we called carbon capture and utilization, which has been gaining in, let's say, acceptance and sort of profile over the last years. But we started all the way back in 2006. So I guess through that, we have advanced to a stage where the technology is sort of market ready and being commercialized. And that's where we were awarded this recognition based on our sort of achievements so far. We were the first ones to establish an industrial plant that captures CO2 from an industrial emission source and converts that into a liquid, into a chemical called methanol. So this is often now referred to as e-fuel or electrofuel, which is the energy source comes from electricity. And this was established here back in 2012 next to the geothermal power plant in Svartsengi in Iceland. So we have since then been involved in a number of different projects in Europe to scale up and demonstrate the technology, which we call emissions to liquids. And recently we have now been involved in larger plants, commercial size plant in China and also under development in Norway. So yeah, we are commercializing a technology that can capture and convert carbon dioxide into useful products, chemicals, and fuels.
So carbon recycling work with carbon captured from the flue stack, meaning the Svartsengi site was a great place to build their demonstration plant over a decade ago. Not only because they had a ready resource of carbon from the plant itself, but also because they could access plentiful renewable energy to operate their facility. From this base, the company became the first in the world to produce so-called renewable methanol at an industrial scale. And this methanol can be put to all sorts of different uses. You can use it in the production of chemicals, plastics, paints. It can even be used in wastewater treatment. And perhaps more excitingly, it can be used in fuel, either independently or in combination with more traditional fossil-based fuels.
In the years since, carbon recycling have built facilities internationally, and their most recent plant alone is capable of turning around 160,000 tons of carbon dioxide into methanol every year. These are pretty big numbers, and scaled up to dozens or hundreds of plants, that starts to have a real impact.
But as ever, it's important to note these differences between carbon removal and carbon capture, and between carbon sequestration and utilization. Firstly, carbon recycling aren't using carbon that's been pulled out of the air. They're getting it from those sources where it would otherwise be emitted, such as a power station or an industrial facility. And secondly, they're not sequestering this like Carbfix would, but are instead utilizing it, so for instance, for fuels or the chemical production. I guess in that sense, this is still fossil originating carbon that's going to end up in the atmosphere.
Yeah, absolutely. This isn't removal, and it's certainly not permanent sequestration. But what carbon recycling can do is change what happens to that carbon once it's in the system. If you like, they're moving from a single-use model of carbon, where it's simply used once to generate power or manufacture materials and is then emitted, to a model where the carbon is, as their name suggests, recycled. And because that carbon can then be used in contexts that would otherwise be dependent on fossil fuels, they're reducing the amount of carbon that ultimately ends up in the atmosphere.
Yeah, it's actually quite impressive technology.
Yes, it is impressive. This fuel is obviously preferable to petrol or diesel fuel made directly from fossil sources, as it's using carbon that was going to end up in the atmosphere anyway. But we wanted to know, why can't we just electrify everything? With more renewable and low carbon energy coming online all the time, isn't that the future? And shouldn't we therefore be using carbon capture technologies to permanently sequester that carbon rather than using it to power combustion engines? We asked Omar.
The sectors that our technology fits best are the ones that are hard to electrify. So that, for example, includes marine traffics, industries, etc. So, the electrification of transport is a positive development. And in fact, the use of e-fuels or sort of liquid energy carriers in conjunction with batteries can also help to solve problems like with range and also heavy duty vehicles, transport, etc. And that can be in areas where you have stranded resources, like here in Iceland, you have, in a way, stranded resources because we are not connected to the larger market that demands power. And it can also apply to areas where you have a lot of solar and wind resources, but you lack the infrastructure to transfer the energy to the consumer. So it's not necessarily that these are somehow competing. They are complementary solutions, or in some cases addressing completely different markets and problems.
What about aviation fuel?
Yeah, aviation fuel is one of those types of fuel where it's very hard to see that you can have anything but liquid fuels. And of course, here in Iceland, we rely a lot on tourism nowadays, and they need jet fuel to get here. So that's something that has to be addressed and is being addressed. And there are several, let's say, different technology routes to go there, either biological or through these sort of synthetic routes. And our process can also lead to that. So the methanol that is produced can then also later be upgraded to jet fuel. But let's say that the technology is not quite mature enough to do that on a large scale yet. But we see that as a future possibility.
We've talked a lot about all the wonderful things that Iceland is doing to lower its emissions and create a more circular economy. But it is worth reflecting on the fact that it faces challenges like any nation. In fact, Iceland's greenhouse gas emissions per capita were much higher than almost all European countries, despite their comparatively green energy sector. In Iceland's case, this is mostly driven by high net emissions from their land use and land use change, split amongst a fairly sparse population. Taking that out of the equation, it's driven by high levels of private car use, heavy industry, and agriculture. But it's also exacerbated due to its remote location and its particular reliance on tourism. Both people and products looking to get to Iceland have to get there by air or sea. And we know that both routes are high emitting and hard to abate industries.
Yeah, it feels fitting that carbon recycling are actually developing their technology in Iceland then, when you consider that it could offer the chance to mitigate emissions from these sources in particular.
Chatting to Omar, he was also optimistic that technological developments over the coming years will make the methanol they produce even more widely usable. As he said here, this could change the landscape of aviation. And if this carbon could then be captured and reused again, then we're really talking about a circular carbon economy. Right now, it's a bit of a fantasy. But even their current operations would have seemed equally unlikely a few decades ago. Anything can happen. Give it time.
It very much feels that carbon recycling's ethos here, and I would say much of the ethos we came across in Iceland, is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. None of the businesses or the technologies that we witnessed during our time in the country are single-handedly solving the climate crisis, and none can, as we know. And I think as carbon removal enthusiasts, we tend to view anything that isn't simply pulling carbon from the air as a bit of a distraction. But Omar gave a pragmatic vision for what he framed as this transition, and also showed that Iceland has form when it comes to leading these transitions in the past.
Saying that we would transition to more of a circular-based carbon economy. So you will have materials that are made out of carbon. Some of it would be directly, recycled. Some of it maybe need to go through incineration, and then you capture the carbon, and that way. Or you have some materials that are based on the use of biomass. So the transition periods to achieve the targets will involve, of course, significant reduction, but it will take time until all the industrial emitters will stop emitting. Some of them may be able to switch their processes to using directly renewable energy without any carbon. For some, that seems today almost impossible. Production of minerals like cement and others, it's sort of possible to maybe switch to a bio-based carbon source. And then it becomes important to utilize that carbon as well. So the practical way of doing it also is that we have a lot invested in the infrastructure and processes to make our materials today that are based on the use of hydrocarbons. And we don't necessarily need to change out all those processes, installation, etc. We just need to change the starting raw material. And as a society, that's easier to do than to transform everything and start from scratch, essentially. And we have an example of where we did this energy transition here in Iceland for heating and power. But we have a lot to do in terms of decreasing our carbon emissions from transport in particular. But we have the resources here in energy to make that transition happen. And I think the investment in doing that is something that will be worthwhile for the society overall over long term, because Iceland has not only saved a large amount of CO2 from not burning coal for heating like we did in the 40s or 30s, but we also saved a lot of money because it's cheaper to use local geothermal and hydro. And I think that will be the case also in the future for becoming independent of fossil resources. And that is the policy of the Icelandic government, to become independent of fossil resources.
So, Tom, now we've come to the end of the episode. I want to try and recreate that Blue Lagoon vibe that we got at the end of our trip in Iceland, because that's where we said we were going to end up. So put your feet up. Actually, no. Put your feet in a foot bath.
In a salty bath.
Yeah.
Whip out some mud for my face mask.
Yeah. Pour yourself a glass of wine and let's get into it. We're going to be doing our outro as if we're floating in the one and only Blue Lagoon.
I could think of no better place than to talk systems and carbon removal than with you in the Blue Lagoon, Emily.
What a sweetheart. So, Tom, what do you think? Is Iceland just a fertile playground for climate innovation? Or is it something greater? Is it something bigger? Is it something more complex? Are we seeing the future here? What do you think?
I came away from Iceland with a huge sense of, just like future thinking, lots of ideas, lots of inspiration, because what we saw was very inspirational. And I think, in my eyes at least, it definitely is laying down the groundwork for all sorts of kind of future innovations. And I think putting a template together for it that other countries, economies can follow. There was this report that came out by an organization called Rethink X, titled Rethinking Climate Change. And one of the last paragraphs in their report, I think, really neatly ties into what I think Iceland is doing. So I'd like to read it to you, Emily.
Please do, Tom. I'd love to hear it.
So the paragraph goes like this. Humanity is on the cusp of the most profound transformation of the system of production in human history. From an extraction-based system, dependent on exploiting scarce inputs that require scale and reach and centralization, to a creation-based system, a generative model that creates the things that we need from superabundant inputs available everywhere and that is distributed, interconnected and networked. Now, I don't necessarily think that Iceland is that future that I've just described, but I think it's on the path to that. And I think there's definitely this thinking around going from this extraction-based system of thinking to creation-based.
I do love connecting circular economy and carbon removal so intrinsically, like we've talked about it before. But after being in Iceland and seeing everything that's happening there, I'm sort of thinking like, what even is carbon removal if we're not thinking about circularity? We talk about carbon removal as this tool, but I don't think that it can count as very much if the tool isn't used in a circular system. The future isn't just DAC plants, It's this explosion of like revolutionary technologies. When we're looking at the Iceland examples, we can see that it's really a big picture in terms of not just carbon removal and also not just carbon reduction, but the whole winding web of interconnected technologies and solutions and mindsets and tools. And, it's a whole system. The age-old question around carbon removal, is it just an excuse to keep business as usual and then offset it? And if we're just talking about carbon removal, the answer is yes. If carbon removal is the only thing that you change in a system, then it is just an excuse to keep business as usual. But if you're incorporating carbon removal into a different kind of system, into a changed system, a one where carbon emissions have been reduced and awareness of biodiversity is at the forefront and equity and justice, then carbon removal becomes a huge player. It becomes like a cornerstone of a more livable system.
Speaking of transitions, what is happening in the next episode?
Oh, what a segue, Tom. So we haven't quite transitioned to this system yet. We live in the reality of today. And in that reality, we flew to Iceland. So Tom and I and the rest of the team, we wanted to look at how we could offset our flights. And we wanted to share that process with you so that you can understand what we did and hopefully learn how you can also offset your flights in future.
I'm very much looking forward to this next episode. I think it's going to be a super practical way for us to understand how we can have a better climate impact and hopefully others.
Here's hoping. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Carbon Removal Show. We'll see you next time.
See you then.
Ciao.
thanks to everyone who makes this show possible.
Our researcher and fact checker, Henry Irvine.
Our composer, Sam Carter.
Our graphic designer, Reke Campbell.
Our content manager, Jordan Brooks.
Our guest booker, Anna DeWolf Evans.
Our editor, Mercy Barno.
Our producer, Ben Weaver Hinks.
Our project manager, Patrick Carter.
And our executive producer, Sam Floyd. Thank you so much for listening to The Carbon Removal Show. Follow us on Twitter at RestoredCC, follow us on LinkedIn at The Carbon Removal Show, and you can visit our website, restored.cc. We're all over the internet. And please remember to give us a rate and review. It really makes a difference. Thank you so much.
Co-fruition.